Good evening. In the days of Pandit Nehru, Marshal Tito, General Sukarno and Abdul Nasser, the non-aligned movement saw its heyday. As a movement which had nearly 120 developing nations as its members, at one point it served a very important purpose indeed, that of providing a balance and an umbrella for nations who did not want to toe either the US line or the Soviet line. Over the years, however, many believe NAM has lost its purpose, clout and indeed its relevance. The non-aligned movement has never really been too united after its initial success, chiefly because of external political, military and economic inducements. As the 16th NAM summit begins and gets underway, this time in Tehran, the movement finds its solidarity unglued further as many member countries feel less attached to its agenda, be it because of the improved economic conditions or the self-confidence that developing nations have gained in the last decade. The West today, and the US especially, questions the credibility of a movement that will be chaired by the so-called die-hard West haters like Iran. The non-aligned movement, according to experts, lacks internal cohesion because many member countries are tied to the US in various ways, be it military aid, regime protection or economic aid as well. As the Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh tries a high-wire balancing act at the summit, we will discuss the importance of a NAM summit in Tehran and the significance of the fact that Iran will chair the NAM for the next 3 years. We'll also look at the big picture. Can the non-aligned movement reinvent itself? What would be required to make that happen? What role will India play in such a scenario? My distinguished panel tonight includes Professor Aditya Mukherjee from JNU, also Veena, Sikri, former ambassador as well. Joining us in just a bit will be Pramit Chaudhri, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times. Welcome you all to the show. I'd like to start with Veena, Sikri, if I could. Now, India has an extremely treacherous task in Tehran right now. We love Iran one day, we hate them the next day, we give them a lot of love, they take it back the next day. We stand up for them when they're hit with sanctions, we cut our oil imports the next day. This is a very strange situation we find ourselves in. What I'd like to ask you is it in India's best interest if NAM is revived with nations like Turkey, India, Egypt at the forefront? In other words, does India really still need the NAM to pull its weight?
Yes, I think in one word, India very much needs NAM, and NAM also needs India. I think it's a mutually beneficial relationship, and I'm speaking on this from personal experience because I have been member of the Indian delegation to 4 NAM summits, from Colombo in 1976 to Havana to New Delhi and to Kuala Lumpur in 2003. I have seen the relevance of NAM evolve, and certainly as times change, in the post-Cold War era, NAM has to also change, and NAM has been changing. I think our Prime Minister's speech today at NAM was very significant because he was able to bring all the issues together and relate it to the theme of the present NAM summit, which is lasting peace through joint global governance. And actually, as our Prime Minister said, the reason for many of the problems in the world today is that global governance is driven by power equations of the past. And these are totally inadequate to meet the challenges of today. Right. And Prime Minister has highlighted 4 or 5 sectors, very crucial, in which NAM can play a very relevant role. These are international terrorism, ensuring cyber security, weapons of mass destruction, which means nuclear disarmament, ecologically sustainable development, including water security, food security, and energy security, as well as countering maritime piracy. Now, in all these, you need international global institutions like the UN Security Council, World Bank and IMF to be reformed. Our Prime Minister also spoke on very sensitive issues like Syria, Palestine, and he said that we do not need external intervention. He was very clear on that. We do not need external intervention. We need a non-violent approach to meet the democratic aspirations of a large number of countries. Right. So I think these are the highlights of what NAM can do and what NAM needs to do, because you have a forum here, 2/3 of the membership of the UN, and of course, NAM is relevant. Why would more than 50 prime ministers, presidents and vice presidents come together for 3 days if they did not think there was a role to be served? What is true is that the members of NAM do have other associations. There is the G20, there is SAARC, and sometimes the views of NAM are important. The presidents and prime ministers subscribe to it, but in other associations you see difference. But this is a balancing act that NAM needs to do, And India's leadership at this time is crucial.
It's interesting you mentioned the relevance of NAM, and you, of course, say that NAM is still relevant. We'll come to that in just a bit, but I want to go to Professor Aditya Mukherjee for 1 second. Now, let's talk about the summit itself, Professor Mukherjee. And the question on everybody's mind, this is apparently Iran's biggest PR exercise in years. Will it be successful? Has Tehran successfully managed to show the world, and when I say the world, I mean the West, especially the US, that bankrupt it might be reeling from sanctions, but isolated it is not?
I think so. I think that it is a very poignant moment, so to speak, for Iran. And the NAM serves this purpose very well, because right from its inception, what was NAM supposed to do? It was supposed to give voice to the underdog, give voice to all the former colonial countries, the weak countries who didn't have either military power or economic power. And that is, that role the NAM has continued to play, even though the composition may have changed. And it is a matter of chance that Iran happens to be, and I think it's very interesting and important that Iran happens to be presiding over the NAM at this point of time. And whether one agrees with Iran or not, the issue is not that one agrees with the United States or Iran. The issue is that here is a forum where a large part, forum independent of other forums which have hegemons. The NAM still fortunately doesn't have a hegemon. It's not the United Nations where you may disagree on who all are the key players, but there is everybody's agreed that there are certain key players. There is no Security Council in NAM with a veto. So in that situation, I think it's extremely important that Iran has got this opportunity to put their voice across.
Absolutely.
It's good for India as well, that an opportunity to say something that we often are not able to say for various reasons will be said in NAM.
Absolutely. Speaking of hegemons, Veena, Sikri, the United States is fuming. A spokesperson for the White House, while not naming India very clearly, said very clearly that world leaders who disregarded their boycott call, the Israel-US boycott call, have let them down. The fact that the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is also there in Tehran doesn't really help the US position / rhetoric / whatever you want to call it. Thoughts, please.
I think that, yes, the US has a particular position on Iran, and it has been talking to India and other countries to fall in line. But I think India has quite rightly been following a studiously independent course, taking into account our relationships with the US and other nations, and we have managed that quite well. We had difficulties several years ago, in the vote in the IEA and so on. But today we are able to. I think the talks on Chabahar port are very important. The discussions with the bilateral discussions with Ahmadinejad are important, and Prime Minister's speech has highlighted some of the issues on which Iran would have been very happy to hear our Prime Minister's views. So I think while the US has its position on Iran, I think the US also has talks with Iran. We know they've been having talks with Iran. So I think that every nation is fully within its right to pursue its own self-interest and maintaining its relations with all other countries.
Hold that thought. We'll take a small break right now. After the break, Pramit Chaudhri, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, will join us. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Pramit Chaudhri joins us now. Pramit, welcome to the show, first of all. The civil war in Syria also is going to figure prominently in the Tehran talks this time around. Mohammad Morsi is the new kid on the block in the Arab states as well. He wants Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and Iran to go for a convention on Syria particularly. Do you see any mutual cooperation between the big four in the region, or do you expect to happen what almost always happens when Arab powers meet, they hug, they pose and end up going back despising each other?
Well, yes, I think there's a sort of jostling among these four countries because they all see themselves as potential leaders of the West Asian world, if you wish. What you're seeing with Morsi's arrival is the return of Egypt. Until now, Egypt, which has been the largest Arab nation, has been under Mubarak completely outside of the political agenda of the Islamic world. Morsi is now returned, and he's basically saying, Egypt, the traditional leader of the Arab world, is now coming back, and we wish to form a contact group on Syria. Neither the Turks or the Iranians are very happy with this, because their entire
Especially
policy,
the Iranians.
Yeah, well, their entire policy has been, no, we should be the new leaders of the Arab street. And they realize that obviously Egypt, being an Arab country, unlike Turkey and Iran, has a much greater credibility with the Arab street than ever before. And as a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is probably the dominant political force both in Syria and in Jordan, and its affiliates in North Africa, is in many ways the dominant Arab political movement of the day, Morsi is stronger than anybody. And as you may have noticed already, he made a very strong statement against the Syrian government, leading to the Syrian delegation walking out of NAM.
Right.
But that's exactly what Morsi wanted, because within the Sunni Arab world, they're looking at him and saying, forget the Shia Persians or the Turks.
Let's go with the Arabs.
This is the man we want to have as our leader.
Right. Fair point. Professor Aditya Mukherjee, with Iran now holding the presidency of NAM for the next 3 years, do you see Tehran pushing its nuclear program even harder, bolstered by the sheer number of world leaders that are willing to come to Tehran and sit across the table and talk to them? And what would that mean for the rest of the member countries? Will they gather the will to reprimand them if they cross the line?
See, I'll go by, again, as I was saying, that what NAM has enabled India to do. It has enabled, as I said, the weakest countries, newly independent countries, poor countries like India to have a voice, and Nehru was very conscious of this. And it is the post-Second World War effort at creating such a body that eventually comes into the NAM. Now, it is because of the leadership of NAM or participation in NAM, to a very great extent, that India gets away with not signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But of course, what the NAM enables you to do, or such like institutions enables you to do, because NAM is not all about just diplomatic finesse. It's about creating the economic and social counterpart. Now, it's that which such conglomerations enable you to do. And India sees that opportunity. It is in this period, for example, to give you an example, it is the Lyndon Johnson kind of statements, that India must be held on a short leash, which Indira Gandhi takes up and uses the NAM to create a situation economically that you are not on the short leash. Now, I think if Iran gets that opportunity, that it is not put on a short leash, that would be Iran's victory. It's not an issue of whether they have whether they expand their nuclear program or not. But it is the right of a sovereign nation to take sovereign decisions.
Can Ahmadinejad pull off an Indira Gandhi?
Well, so the historical comparisons are not fair, but I wouldn't be able to answer that.
I'll come to Veena Sikri now. We talked about before the show how we want to talk about the relevance of NAM. Is the non-aligned movement sort of disconnected from the stark realities of a post-Cold War era?
I think NAM has been, over the last 10 years, trying to adapt and find its relevance in the post-Cold War era. And I think that some of the issues that our Prime Minister highlighted are precisely those where NAM can find a common footing and where they can move together in unison. Because we do know, for example, our Prime Minister mentioned Africa. And I think Africa's, suffering in terms, although they're very rich in resources and a very vibrant population, but they're suffering in terms of economic decline, food scarcity, water scarcity, lack of energy security, despite having the resources. Now, here is a situation where NAM can come together. I think Prime Minister spoke about non-renewable sources of energy and renewable sources of energy. So he spoke about NAM getting together, finding the ways where they specialize. He spoke about IT, information technology. India is prepared to help all other non-aligned countries in the knowledge sector, which will give our youth. 90% of the world's youth is living in developing countries. 80% of the world's population is living in developing countries. So I think NAM has every means to reinvent itself if they come together on these fronts.
I put the same question to Pramit Pal. Naysayers still maintain that the non-aligned movement's rationale has disappeared with the end of East-West polarization. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, the word non-aligned doesn't really mean that much anymore. You're right. Who are you aligned with or against? I think what you're really seeing is a proliferation of multilateral organizations, partly because nobody actually knows which way the world international system is going to go. So you now have IBSA, you now have BRICS, you have a whole set of different organizations. Sometimes you line them up, it's really quite amazing, the number. And India is hedging just like every other country. We don't know right now, for example, the LDCs and India are slowly diverging on a lot of economic interests. Right. We still have some, but we have some differences, obviously, with them. On the other hand, the emerging economies, the BRICS-IBSA combinations, we don't always have an agreement with them either. We clearly have differences with China on a whole number of fronts, for example. So we have that as well, but we don't know where that's going to go. We even have things like the Commonwealth, and we have all these other little organizations that we maintain. So it's not a question of us saying that our entire foreign policy, this is the pillar of our foreign policy. What we have is a multilateral foreign policy in which we have a multiple set of options that we will pursue depending on where we see our interests develop and where we see the rest of the world moving in relation to
there you agree with
ourselves.
Veena Sikri when she says that India does need the NAM, but should India's foreign policy and foreign policy goals be limited to a NAM viewpoint?
Absolutely not.
It can never be. It can never be. India's viewpoints are too diverse, and we have interest in so many different sectors. On some levels with developed countries, on other levels with developing countries. But if we are seeking, say, a larger role in the United Nations, the reform of the United Nations Security Council, we need NAM support. We need the votes of the developing countries. And what India does in terms of leadership for NAM on issues which are relevant to NAM, like economic and human resource development and water security, where we can play a positive role, that reflection of that support will come in other issues, which India needs the support of all the NAM countries.
Professor Mukherjee, where do you stand on that? You heard both my panelists as well. Do you agree?
Yeah, you see, the NAM is not supposed to perform the functions that IBSA, BRICS and others do. I mean, they do similar things in some ways, but dissimilar in other ways. You know, there are regional cooperations that are possible for specific issues, etc. But then these same underdeveloped countries have some common interests which cut across these regional groupings. And NAM can address that. It is the largest body after all. I mean, it's not just group of, 3, 4, 5, 8 countries.
120 countries. That's
2/3 of the United Nations. And also in terms of influencing overall the mood of the world, so to speak. It's not specifics. The specifics are done by BRICS and IBSA and stuff like that. It's the overall mood. It's major policy changes. For example, why does NAM come up? It's because the Bretton Woods institutions post-Second World War were seen as institutions which were dominated by this, that or the other. There was a need felt. Now, how you address the need concretely will be one kind of thing that one will do. But NAM is not going to sit down and have what, as I said, these smaller organizations.
Very briefly, sir, what would you say to people who say that NAM has lost its relevance at all? But what should we give them an example of NATO, for example? What is NATO? NATO is also, it came post-Cold War. After the Cold War, NATO kind of lost its relevance, but it's spreading its spread, so to say, numerically, geographically, what have you. What would you say to those people?
NAM and the bipolar world are not to be mixed up, I think. Non-alignment can function equally well in a unipolar world. The idea of NAM is sovereignty. Sovereignty to smaller nations, weaker nations, sovereignty and development. How do they have a secure, sovereign, developing country in the world? Because the NAM is the post-colonial era. It's the definition of an organization which will deal with this or create this post-colonial era. And a unipolar world actually is even a more difficult situation, because when the world was bipolar, you could use one against the other, as India did quite skillfully, and many other countries did. Now you don't have the Soviet Union, to back you up when you get dominated. The Iran can't fall back on Soviet Union. It has to. NAM becomes even more important because you are the only body which can.
I think that the very criticism of NAM that, say, countries like the US have shows that there is something there. It's not something to be totally forgotten about and ignored. But certainly its place in the world structure, it has to seek for itself. And that is where India does have a role to play.
And what would that role be, Pramit Pal? What role do you see India having if the next 3 years Iran is presiding over it? Iran and India ostensibly trying to get closer to each other. What role do you see India play for the next 3 years?
Well, I think the key issue right now for us is to preserve the NAM from being wrecked by what's happening in the West Asian sphere. Remember, when you talk to Iranians, they themselves are extremely skeptical of NAM. Why? Because the bloodiest war they have fought in recent history was with Iraq. These were two NAM countries going to war. NAM was unable to do anything about it, and the Iranians have not forgotten that.
And 8 long years.
Yeah, and it was an incredibly bloody war. I mean, forget about the other wars, that the American invasions. The number of Iranians who died in that war is left an incredible trauma on that country. And for them, NAM was a complete failure, because this was two NAM countries going to war. NAM was unable to do anything about it. So they're very skeptical as to how far NAM. So India needs to make sure that NAM, should we say, the expectations regarding NAM are kept limited, so that that NAM itself, if you're going to preserve this as an organization that may have a role in some other places later on, you don't get it. So don't say this is going to be an organization that can solve the Syrian civil war, because it's not going to be able to do that.
It's also going to be tricky for India, given the fact that the US is not really happy.
I don't think the United States takes the NAM, is not particularly bothered about NAM, because after the end of the Cold War, NAM doesn't really pose any serious ideological threat to the United States in any way. And the real pole that's arisen is China. And China doesn't factor into the NAM game at all. Because
so you're saying the US is more worried about China than any other formation like NAM?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, China is by far the defining geopolitical concern of the United States right now, especially as it's withdrawing from Iraq and withdrawing from Afghanistan. China is the overriding geopolitical concern that the United States has, and NAM doesn't factor into this. In fact, America, to some degree, will be happy that NAM exists. Particularly, it acts in many ways as one more buffer against Chinese expansion, because what China is developing is a set of bilateral relations all across the world, which the core of which is in Beijing, the hub is in Beijing. And Africa, now it's spreading into Latin America. But
before we go into a break, you had a point to make.
Yes, I was saying that another geopolitical factor of China not being there in NAM, I think that's another point for India to consider, because the relationships you develop in NAM, and this has a long history now, we've celebrated the Golden Jubilee of NAM last year. I think this itself gives India another reason to look at the relationships it can evolve through NAM, through collective activities in economic, human resource development, those kind of areas, non-threatening areas, but very important areas and very positive impact on quality of life in individual NAM countries, particularly smaller countries.
Right. We'll take a small break right now. Closing arguments on the big picture after the short break. Welcome back to the big picture. I'll start this segment with Professor Aditya Mukherjee. Sir, briefly, if you could, the Prime Minister is meeting not just Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but also the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Is that of particular significance to you?
Of course, it is of great significance. But, to come back to the NAM issue, if you will permit,
briefly.
Since you mentioned, the issue of China, this, that, and the other, whether it will be the Iran issue will be sorted out, whether, I don't think that NAM is the body which is even concerned with this kind of thing. If I again may use a historical example, it's not the nitty-gritty of getting this, that, or the other. Like when Nehru takes a big position in the world on Vietnam or on Korea, etc. It's not that some success occurs, no victory there, but it's the position that the global impact that you make. And the United States, you may not be able to checkmate United States through the NAM on the nuclear issue, but it is of great significance. I don't agree with Pramit on this, that NAM is not what they're worried about, they're worried about China. A global power requires an ideological hegemony over this world. And if, 200 countries say that, we don't agree with you or tend to go against it, they better take it seriously. Right. Otherwise, you're not going to be a global, hegemonic power. So I think it's very important.
Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think that of these 120 countries, a large number of them already have extremely close relationships with the United States and don't, in fact, have major geopolitical or bilateral problems with the United States, including India. So I would argue that non-alignment and NAM movement defines itself as being an anti-American movement. I think is simply wrong. It's no longer the case.
You know, I think that the challenge for NAM is that it is not anti-anyone today. It's completely outdated to think of NAM in the post-Cold War world as being anti-American. It's not that. The problem of NAM, the challenge to NAM today is that they take important decisions, useful decisions, but then when they go back to their smaller groupings, whether it is IPSA or SARC, or they have different points of view. So leadership of NAM is very important to reconcile those regional and sub-regional considerations, other bilateral relationships with USA or with China, with the overall broad interests of NAM, which can be, again, as I say, in economics, human resource development, water security, energy security, food security. The long-lasting, the permanent interests of all countries are in these issues, and NAM can find its relevance by focusing on these issues.
Non-intervention by other powers.
Yes.
Right. It's a very important
we have, a Prime Minister spoke about it today, that external interventions are to be completely avoided. Non-violent approach to solving problems. This is where India can give leadership.
Of course, Professor Mukherjee mentioned that it's really important that he's meeting Khamenei as well.
Yes,
but won't it make the tightrope act that he's currently performing in Tehran even more difficult for Dr. Manmohan Singh?
No, I think that the Americans and all other countries would understand the importance of India's leadership role in NAM, and that India has attended almost all NAM summits at the prime ministerial level, and they would appreciate that the bilateral discussions with Khomeini and with Ahmadinejad have an important signature. Chabahar Port, for example. The Americans too are interested. Whatever they may say about a lack of cooperation between India and Iran on Chabahar Port, they would like Afghanistan to have another alternative. They would like themselves to have another alternative to reach goods to Afghanistan without using the Pakistan route. So I think that commonality of interest is subdued. It's not spoken about. But I think it's very much in America's interest as well for India to maintain a clear and direct relationship with Iran and to continue its cooperation with Iran, whether it is in energy, developing of infrastructure, and so many other issues. India can have an important role there.
I think we have time for one last question, Pramit. The fact that over 40 big leaders of big nations are in Tehran right now, including Ban Ki-moon, who's the UN Secretary General as well, what does that tell you? What is the biggest takeaway from the Tehran NAM summit for you, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a continuing debate, or should I say a resurrection of a debate about what is the best way to handle the issue of Iran's nuclear capacity. And the U.S., Western Israel position is isolation, and also a lot of the Arab countries, especially the Gulf nations, support the basic argument that you have to isolate Iran as hard as possible. Ban Ki-moon, for example, has gone there, but he's violently criticized Iran.
He wants them to shut down the nuclear
He says, yeah, you have to, but what he is saying, a message is that you can't shut them down by isolating them, you've got to engage with them. And that's basically the debate that the NAM summit will partially resurrect.
Right.
And that's why Khamenei is important, because Ahmadinejad is now a complete cipher in Iranian politics.
Right.
It is the supreme leader who is now controlling.
That's all the time we have, Pramit. I must stop you there. I must thank all my guests before I sign off. Pramit Pal Chaudhri, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Ambassador Veena Sikri. That was the big picture today. Till next time, Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thanks for watching.